Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. I want to discuss with you a little bit today about what I call the decentralized investment thesis, and specifically what this refers to is not finance, is not crypto, is not decentralized finance, but decentralization in a broader sense that I think is important to be aware of as a trend from an investment standpoint. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, in my view, some of the possible investment opportunities that come out of this, some of the things that would be negative from an investment perspective, and I would love to hear your guys' thoughts as well, so you can put them in the comments below. Before we dive into this subject, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell, hit the little ding button there so you get reminded. If you would like help with the things that we deal with here, which are setting yourself, basically building a global strategy for yourself and for your business, we can help you with figuring out what is the best solution for you, including the tax optimization, etc., for your company, as well as yourself personally, figuring out where to go if you want to relocate abroad, helping you to get other citizenships, second citizenship planning, plan Bs, etc. Please reach out to us. You can book a call with me, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, or you can send a message through offshorecitizen.net. Okay. Now, the basic idea here is we have for quite a long period of time, multiple decades, had these centralizing forces in our world. You might argue that the advent of the personal computer was sort of a decentralizing force, right? You went from big mainframes, etc., to personal computers, ultimately then to the internet and maybe to smartphones. But now we've been coming back to very centralized platforms like Facebook, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Netflix, etc., right? But that's just looking at the digital realm. In addition to this, we've had a trend of globalization, right? You've seen a lot of mergers, a lot of major company roll-ups. We've seen small mom and pop restaurants go out of business, replaced by big chains. You've seen that throughout many, many areas. And for the last while, though, I think you've started to see the opposite. And the opposite becomes really, really apparent when you just consider how things are going in Europe, in particular in Germany right now. So I did a video previously about this. The energy prices in Germany have gone up over 1,000% in a year. Now, if you're in a situation where your energy prices have gone up over 1,000% in a year, sounds really appealing? Probably getting some solar panels and some battery packs, right? Because look, the amount of sun that's shining hasn't changed. The price of solar panels hasn't gone up 10x. The price of batteries hasn't gone up 10x. And certainly the amount that you can store or the amount of consumption has not changed by 10x. So you've got yourself a great backbone of protection and stability in your life and your overall situation. So this is an example of decentralized power generation, right? But I think there's a lot of other areas. And so this is sort of following a theme that we're seeing globally. It comes in postmodernism, right? If you look at what is the kind of theme of postmodernism, it is the breakdown of institutions, etc., the lack of trust in those. We see kind of on the other side libertarianism, which sort of advocates the same sort of thing. We see groups, interestingly, both Trump and Bernie Sanders represented a backlash against sort of the establishment, the deep state, things like this, depending on how you want to refer to it. And so this is just a general trend. And I think it's a logical trend when you consider the failure of centralized institutions, right? You can look at, California has had rolling blackouts for quite some time now. So we're talking about the wealthiest state in the wealthiest country in the world basically acting like a third world banana republic. When I lived in Costa Rica, I remember it was fairly normal that we'd have power outages once a week or so. Water would go out maybe once a month. Well, that's basically the type of thing you're seeing in a supposed developed first world country. And we're starting to see this become more widespread in a bunch of places right now. What does this do? What is the incentive structure here? Well, the incentive structure, I think, is fairly apparent. We see universities are failing us, right? People are going to universities and they're not finding that they're coming out getting jobs, etc. Banks are failing us. You've got failure now of supply chains throughout the world due to, we've seen kind of how things have backed up, etc. We're seeing now failure on the part of power grids and supply of that. arguably there's some risk in certain parts of the world. For sure, there's definite risk of failure when it comes to food supplies. And so you kind of put all this together, and it's like, what is the incentive? The incentive is the people will want to, and are, and have been engaged in for a while now, but it's, I think, reaching sort of a critical tipping point, interested in, I don't want to say self-sovereignty or self-autonomy, but it's building something that they can rely on, they control themselves. We've given so much control away from ourselves. It's sort of, you can just see the pendulum swinging back the other way. That's the basic idea here. And so I think about this and I think of, okay, in this environment, obviously personally we can make some decisions, right? We can invest in, our own power for our own homes. Okay, great, that's good, gives you some resiliency, right? We can potentially invest in some sort of food production, whether this is, I've had increasingly people interested in buying some farmland. Maybe you want greenhouses, maybe you want vertical farming, maybe you want to be in a situation, I'm in Toronto right now, so I'm going to be visiting with a friend who he has a great vertical farming company. My mother has a thing, it's called a water garden or something like that. Anyway, grow various different stuff in her house. So you've got ideas like this that are helpful, right? They can supplement where you're at. What about beyond that? Well, beyond that, it's like, what are the investment opportunities? And the investment opportunities probably play into as well what the opportunities are for individuals. And I've been thinking about this quite a bit. Clearly, on this channel, I've talked lots about cryptocurrency. That's kind of the idea of decentralized finance, etc. But it goes beyond, I think, just finance. Now, in the world of crypto, one of the notable projects, which hasn't really gained traction in terms of user adoption, but was very interesting in terms of bootstrapping a network, was Helium. Helium protocol was designed to essentially decentralize internet service providing. And so people would buy hardware, which would allow them to essentially broadcast an internet signal, and they could get paid for doing that in order to essentially try and provide an internet service for a broad base of people at a lower cost, right? That's kind of the general idea, or at least a decentralized version of that. In reality, the problem with it is you need almost universal coverage in order for it to be compelling as a consumer, which probably isn't going to be the case for most people. Starlink is probably a much more interesting project, and so, good stuff there. But I think that idea of bootstrapping networks of real stuff is quite fascinating. So here are a few areas that I think are interesting to look at from an investment perspective based on this decentralized trend, so you can kind of pay attention accordingly. First of all, anything related to vertical farming, etc., is like the ability to localize your food production, I think is super interesting. Number two, things where you can localize your power production. Again, however that happens to be. Obviously, battery storage is like one of the biggest, or energy storage in general is one of the biggest things. A few years ago, I was in Hawaii and I visited an energy storage research park. Very, very cool. It's on the Big Island. If a person gets a chance to go there, they have all sorts of stuff where they were showing off hydrogen fuel cells and hydrogen power as a storage mechanism, which is really interesting and underexploited actually, as well as various different battery systems and so on and so forth. So that's interesting. The next that we could look at is, I think, decentralized manufacturing. So here I think about 3D printing. One of the things that is kind of interesting is when supply chains are not working that well, what can you do? Well, if you have 3D printing, you don't need to rely on a supply chain. You can essentially just get a CAD drawing of something and you can potentially build it. And 3D printers range in price from a few $100s to tens of thousands of dollars or more, depending on what level you're getting. So maybe something doesn't work for a certain group of people, but works for another group of people. I think this is an area. First of all, it's been growing exponentially, but it's probably going to grow a lot more. So we've got, and by the way, very, very interesting technologies to the point where they're printing metal. For example, there's a company called Desktop Metal. There's Markforged. There's some others that can do some really cool stuff. Whether they're good investments or not, totally different conversation. You can go and take a look into that yourself. But I think this move towards decentralized, distributed manufacturing is super fascinating. And it's especially fascinating when you consider that there are other trade-offs that come in a deglobalizing world. What I would say is that our globalization has happened for quite a while. It probably peaked sometime around, sometime between 2008 and 2021, or 2020, sorry, was probably the decline of globalization started sometime in then. And now we're likely to see it accelerate? We'll see, but as we get kind of more hoarding, as we get more differences in geographies, as we get increased polarization, as people tend to move to areas that they like more, and they do so for values reasons, there's lots of reasons why we'll see more deglobalization. And in a deglobalized world, what do you find? You find that if I'm going to sell products, having them delivered a long way, it's better if I can manufacture and deliver very close, right? Number two, if my cost of production is going up, my cost of delivery due to, say, high oil prices, etc., or slow supply chains, any of these situations, imagine if you were Walmart and your transport cost went up by a factor of 6 for large transport vehicles. Well, if you're not having to do that transport, you eliminate that variable cost, right? Or at least you reduce it quite dramatically. So that's really cool. The next thing that you end up with is potential regulations. So if you're trying to sell into a particular region, it's difficult if you have to deal with import-export rules. And so if you can simply manufacture it locally, that's great. Traditionally, we had obviously cost savings by having local people in countries where the wages were lower going and doing physical manufacturing of things. But if you can automate it with machines, then the amount of wages doesn't really matter that much, and this takes away. So this is kind of a way of competing. So I think that's really interesting technology. There's probably decentralized water. So one of the things that I think is really great for people to have is water purification systems. Just aside from the fact that you can probably get yourself healthier water, the fact that you have that as an ability and then you can support companies that are doing that, that's also really interesting. There might be good investment or marketing opportunities there. I think in general, across the world, we're seeing this. I mean, you might say that Airbnb is a move towards it, right? Kind of decentralizing the distribution of where people stay. So in general, from my perspective, businesses that are going to benefit from this decentralization trend, which I think will probably continue out over the next 10 to 20 years, are probably a good place to look for investments. Now, there's going to be lots that are going to fail. This is not to say that they're all going to succeed, etc. But more and more, it is easier and easier to do this, and so that's a win. At the same time, businesses that are likely to be disrupted by this are ones that I think are a bad investment, or at least they have a significant threat to their business model. And so you should watch for possible risks. Now, some of them might be centralized but benefit from decentralization. For example, stuff like YouTube, right? I don't think YouTube's going to go anywhere. I think that people are going to continue to put out YouTube videos, etc. So you've got a centralized platform, but you have decentralized content production. Something like Etsy is probably interesting in this regard. Again, centralized platform, but decentralized. Shopify, same sort of deal, etc., etc. Anyway, let me know what you think. If there are some cool areas that you see where decentralization of real world stuff is useful for people and likely to be more useful in the future, I would love to hear it. And I will look forward to seeing you on the next video.